Hi there. Well, it looks like people like me, uh, especially with no urgent and um, completely inescapable business outside, will be under lockdown for the foreseeable future. And I'm not going anywhere, so I've got time. So I'm wanting to do a series of lectures on one of my favorite themes, which is Jesus and Africa, looking at 2,000 years of the church on the continent. My name, by the way, I realize I should introduce myself. I'm Martin Mostert, and the material that I'll be dealing with is material about the history of the Christian movement over the last 2,000 years. And there's fascinating stuff out there, stuff that people don't realize, and important data about who we are as the African church. And so I'm going to start right from the dawn of Christianity and try and paint a picture of how Christianity, through its mission, spread into all the areas of Africa that it has. So here we go. It'll take, it was a, I taught it as a two-term course of 14 3-hour sessions, so it's going to take about 30 sessions. So buckle up, settle down, as we enter a time machine of sorts and go back to the earliest days of Christianity in Africa. Jesus and Africa, and I'm doing these lectures in partnership with Discipling Nations. Now, the traditional view of Christianity in Africa, or the one that the default view for most people, is that Christianity came to Africa with the missionaries of the 1800s. People like David Livingstone and Mary Slessor and C.T. Studd. Now, that's true. That's part of it. But there's much more before the 1800s, much more during the 1800s itself, and much more since the 1800s. So let's widen our view and find out what actually happened. And I'd like to introduce you to my favorite archaeologist, Dr. Sada Mire. She and her family had to escape from Sudan when she was a child, and she grew up in Sweden, I think it was, and went to university, studied archaeology, and she is actually digging out the truth about Christianity in Africa, in Sudan. We need to join her in going back in time and scratching around and seeing whether we don't come up with a different picture, perhaps, to the one that we have of Christianity in Africa. And as Vera Pavlikova-Vilhanova says, African Christianity is as old as Christianity itself. Christianity has had a foothold in the African continent for almost 2,000 years. And it's that foothold in the continent, more than a foothold, that footprint in African sand that we're going to look at. But the first three lectures of the series, I'm going to look at the background to Christianity coming to Africa. And the main, or the most outstanding thing, is that the Christian input or development in Africa came against the background of 20 centuries of invasion colonizations. And I'm going to look at 6 different invasion colonizations. There might be more, but these are the main ones that I think we can trace with the most ease. And it's important, very important, to have this reality in mind, because Christianity did not come just by itself. It came in conjunction with, at the same time as, Africa was being plundered. Africa's been regarded as a treasure chest continent by the rest of the world. Even in the biblical record, Africa is the place. And mercenaries in 2 Chronicles 12 verse 3 talks about troops of Libyans, Sukkites, and Cushites. Africa as a source for soldiery for the wars of other areas of the world. And generally a sense that this desire, this gem, this treasure trove needs to come under the control, the empire of some stronger nation. In Esther 1, verse 1, Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia. Daniel 11:43 talks about Libyans and Cushites being in submission. Ugly talk, but a reality that outsiders looked to dominate and control Africa, and have for centuries. Sorry, I'm going backwards instead of forwards on my slides. But it's also the continent that God loves. Africa features in the Bible in covenant inclusion. In Genesis 12 verse 3, it says, all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That includes the peoples of Africa. And Amos 9 verse 7 says to the says to the Israelites, are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites? God's got the same concern for the well-being and the moral, the goodness of the African nations as he has for his own nation. The same fatherly concern. There's a longing for salvation. In Psalm 68 verse 31, the psalmist writes, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands to God. Lovely phrase. And of course the early mission in Acts 8 verse 27, Philip meets an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasure of the Kandake. And we'll look at that in due course, that interaction, because it shows us a lot about what was happening in the early days of the church. So Christianity has come to Africa, it's spread, it's grown, and it's now been taken out by Africans to the rest of the world in a wonderful new development and reality of Christian mission. But it's all happened amidst 20 centuries of plunder by other peoples. Everyone wants a bit of Africa. And that's the background to Jesus and Africa. It's this plundering of the continent by others. And so we're going to look at 6 invasion colonizations, 5.5 really. First of all, we look at the Phoenician invasion. The Phoenicians were a strange and mysterious people. We're not sure where they came from. But they appeared as powerful traders in the Mediterranean basin. It's important to note, though, that as they established their bases in North Africa, particularly, that Africa was not empty at the time. Africa's never been empty. The Berber nations were already strong African peoples, strong African empires. They were strong, they had a strong agriculture, a strong trade and trade route control, and a powerful national identity. From an invader's point of view, they had a lot of things that were worth taking. Now the Berbers' wealth was based on their control of these trade routes. Let me show you the map that I've found. The ivory and gold and slaves, the produce of the fertile regions of Africa could only reach the Mediterranean through trade routes that, of course, the Berbers controlled. And so anyone who controlled Gat and Gao and Agadez and Sijil Massa and Timbuktu was going to have the power to call the shots, be a nation, and grow in wealth and capacity to be a nation amongst the nations. Now, there's a myth that things just happen to Africans. Like, you know, other people happen to Africans. It's not true, and the Berbers show. The Berbers, amongst many others, show that's not true. And Pekka Massanen, a Finnish historian, says the notion that Africans have always been nothing but passive objects in their encounter with other civilizations, having no interest to explore the world outside their home village, is both oversimplified and ahistorical. By that he means it's a lot of nonsense. Excuse me, another word was hovering in the wings there. But now Phoenicia, let's get back to Phoenicia. It was a classic invasion colonization strategy. About 900 BC, the Phoenician traders started to make bases in North Africa. In 800 BC, Carthage was established. Just think of the analogues between what happened in the far north and the far south of Africa, and you'll see that there's something very similar going on. In about 500 BC, Tipasa was founded, and then various market towns and anchorages like Hippo Regius, also called Annaba, Rusicade, also called Skikda. Names to conjure with. Wonderful places. But places built for one purpose only, and that was to extract goods from Africa to trade them. And this is a map of the early Phoenician trading routes. Very interesting. They were primarily a sea-going nation, and they traded all around the Mediterranean. Shipwrecks of Phoenician ships turn up all around these areas, and actually, very interestingly enough, there's this trade route here. This goes up to Britain, and particularly to Cornwall, and we'll talk about that later in as we look at early days in North Africa, because of the influence, the early mission from Africa to other parts of the world. Now, these trade routes required trade, and as the Phoenicians became wealthy, they became powerful, and bit by bit the Phoenicians enslaved Berbers. The Phoenicians made Berbers pay tribute. The Phoenicians employed many Berbers as mercenaries, fighting their wars on their behalf, and so really the lords of the desert became slaves to the traders. It has happened many places. The power of the trader is able to subvert the power of the warrior. Very interesting, and quite ugly in its own way. But the Berbers fought back. This was a people with strong national identity, and although the Phoenicians worked hard at keeping them in their place, they weren't able to succeed long term. In 241 to 238, there was a mercenary revolt. If you don't pay your soldiers, expect them to fight about it. You don't arm people, organize them into armies, and then not pay them. You don't pay them. You're asking for trouble. And trouble happened over unpaid salaries. Carthage was taken. All the northern dominions was retaken by the Berbers. There was this resurgence of the Berber nations. There was a Libyan Berber coin minted around that time, and they carved out, they recarved, they retook their possessions for a while, long while, until the Romans came in 146 BC. No, let me get that right. Romans, there was still a Berber kingdom. In 146 BC, the Berber kingdom could exist further because the Romans destroyed Carthage. They destroyed the Phoenician foothold. There you go. Keep a check on me. I do get things wrong sometimes. And by about 100 BC, 3 Berber kingdoms had emerged. There's Mauritania on the... this is back to front, so I'll go the right way. Mauritania on the far west, and 2 in Numidia, inland from the coast. And these were powerful and viable nations that withstood a lot of pressure and consider themselves to be completely independent. This is very important, this sort of invasion and fight back struggle, because it's the background in which Christianity happened. And Christianity started to happen after Jesus. Now, it's worthwhile thinking. Churches and mission organizations often use the language of military invasion and colonization, quite frankly. They talk about targets and new territory and strategic points and personnel in position and support systems and campaigns, and God help us, we even sometimes talk about crusades. Now, how do you think that makes people who are not Christians feel about Christian mission? Sounds a bit dodgy. And what different words could we use to refer to all these functions of mission? Just throwing it in there. Think about it. What words do we use, and how do the words we use communicate with people who are not sympathetic to the Christian cause? So that was the first invasion and occupation, colonization, the Phoenicians. They were followed by the Romans. There was then the second one was the Roman invasion, colonization of Africa. And it was based on systematic exploitation of Africa. Now, the Roman provinces were thirsty and greedy. They needed money. I got these figures a while back. I'm still struggling to trace. This was 10 years ago, so I'm struggling to find my source. But it was very expensive to run a kingdom. 37 million denarii per year for the army, 43.5 million denarii for infrastructure like roads and water, and 26 million for entertainment. The income through taxes was 74.5 million or so. So that was a deficit of 32 million. So that means that the Roman Empire would have been driven by its mounting debt to constantly squeeze what it could out of places like North Africa, and squeeze it dead. And we've got records of the squeezing happening at the time of the birth of Jesus in another province of the Roman Empire. There was always a commercial reason for conquest. It was never ideologically driven. So, 24 AD, the Berber territories were annexed by Rome. Trajan built a line of forts, and he had the clever idea of establishing lots of troops there. 28,000 or so troops, although they were mostly local. They were under strict Roman control. And settlers. If you'd been a veteran of the wars in Europe or the wars elsewhere, you got given some land. And the land happened to be in North Africa, which also happened to be the largest grain exporter in the Roman Empire. And the Romans were they loved the gold, they loved the ivory, but what they wanted from Africa was olives, figs, grapes, beans, the ordinary things that keep a city-state going. And as Dr. Paul Abudu, who is a Ghanaian economist, says, the colonization of Africa was based on the exploitation of its natural resources, and not because of the love of the people of Africa by the imperialists. And that's important. It's sad, but it's important to have in mind as we think of how Christianity came to Africa, because it was, of course, at this time, around this time, that Christianity began to spread in Africa. And we need to think about it. Does anything about the Roman colonization of North Africa seem fair to you? You know, just because you're stronger than somebody else, does that mean that you're allowed to take their stuff? We call that mugging. And Africa has been mugged over and over and over and over. And then this is the third invasion colonization. Really is an extension of the second one. It's the Christian Roman invasion colonization, because sorry, going backwards in my notes again. In AD 312, Constantine became a Christian on the back of an overwhelming rate of conversion amongst his soldiers. Constantine realized that to maintain power, he needed to make a trifling adjustment in his religious practices. I'm a bit cynical about Constantine. Not everyone is. I think he was more interested in keeping control and maintaining power in Rome than about faith in Jesus. But certainly he was strongly influenced by the mass conversions of soldiery around the empire to this new faith in Jesus. So the empire was under new management, under Christian management. But it was the same old empire. Wealth still flowed from Africa to Rome, flowed from elsewhere to Rome as well, but we're dealing with Africa. The early church was very good at adjusting to different cultures. They adjusted to Syrian culture and Greek culture and Egyptian culture. They adjusted very well to Roman culture. But there are some ways in which their adjustments to Roman culture compromised their commitment to Jesus, which needs, that needs a whole lecture series on its own. And what difference did Rome becoming Christian make to Africa? Rome was Christian, but from an African point of view, what difference was there? On balance, was Christianity a giver or a taker? These are important questions that we need to ask of history and to ask of ourselves. Let's pray together. Lord of history, help us to never excuse the plundering and domination of one culture by another, whether in the past or the present. Amen. If this is true, and if it's important, then how are you going to pass it on? My usual addendum. You can have these slides for free. You might need a bit of work at your own research in being able to actually teach this, but I want it to be out there so that people can think about these things and discuss these things informally with others, or leave comments. Please leave comments if you've got a question or an observation that I can react to. And after lockdown, you could invite Discipling Nations to run this lecture series, all 30 sessions of it. We also do shorter courses on mission. But in order to help you hammer out your church's response to outsiders outside your church and the watching world. So that's it for today. In the meantime, stay soapy.